Evening. The story is called In Yurd by Popham, who is not me. You'll find him at @Popham. This is fan fiction from Free Old Games, Caves of Cod. It took me, and I thought I might give it a reading. If this has been released to the public, it's only because Mark wanted me to release it that way. I'll be paying him as soon as I've got it uploaded. And so, in Yurd. The plaza in the center of Yurd was a beaten dirt plain, too trod and rocky to grow anything but dry brown grass, with a few half-broken chairs placed in irregular groups along the perimeter, where men too old to work could congregate and grumble. The cats of Yurd spent their nights there, rutting and shitting, and this morning when the sun rose, a slinth sat in one of the chairs, reclining slightly. A wide-brimmed hat, little more than a woven disc of straw with some give in the middle, tilted down from her forehead, shading her face, and her thin green fingers rested on her hips, millimeters above a brace of revolvers whose friction-polished butts of dark wood jutted from a pair of well-worn holsters. She wore a poncho, worked from thin strips of bark, with the front blanket thrown over her shoulder to expose her chest and belly to the sun. And she didn't move, she didn't breathe, the only sign of life being the dew sinking into her skin and a small flower blossoming on her shoulder. The village woke up around her. Those who worked and lived in the few stone buildings which ringed the plaza like the few remaining petals of a dying flower opened their windows or came outside to shake out their sleeping rolls, saw her photosynthesizing there, and quickly hurried back inside to wake and worry their families. Although she did not stir, her presence weighed on them, and throughout the morning they moved like crabs, rushing from one mud brick structure to the other, gossiping and theorizing about her presence. None dared approach her. And then the most surprising thing of all happened. At noon, when the sun hung directly overhead, everyone in Yurd finally turned to their stoves or lathes or lasts, agitated and swearing at their tools, only to look up a moment later to find the outlander gone, the chair overturned in the dust. Again, all work was abandoned, and the townspeople of Yurd emerged to prod the chair, to glare into the desert from which the slinth had clearly emerged, and then returned to their supplies on the precious dew of Yurd, to aggressively leap into outbuildings and barns, only to, moments later, laugh at their own trepidation. It wasn't right, they all agreed, for a slinth to appear like that, in the middle of the night. The next time, they agreed, something would be done. By the late afternoon, the excitement had died down, and everyone was hurrying to finish the work they'd shirked all morning, or they'd given up already, pushed their duties off until tomorrow, and began to drink thick sap wine, standing around the still-prone chair, telling the story of the morning to each other over and over again. Tall sticks topped with torches were brought out and lit to drive away the fleas. More jugs of sap wine were delivered and divvied up. With each telling, the story swelled and thickened. It became a river as powerful and slow as the throbbing in their heads that picked them up and carried them into legend. The miller's daughter Olbus pointed into the desert. "Someone's coming," she said. Olbus was a dreamer and a disappointment to her parents, always staring off into the western deserts or into the distant haze that hung above the forest to the east. And had the slinth not appeared that morning, her mother would have slapped her and sent her back to her chores without looking. But the strange appearance and disappearance of the slinth seemed to presage even more unlikely events, and so, after slapping her daughter, Olbus's mother herself looked out into the western desert, where a small puff of sand on the horizon did indeed indicate that someone was coming. It was a cruel thing that the miller's wife hid her daughter before noticing things, because Olbus was always noticing things. She noticed before anyone else, when rain clouds were going to bruise the sky, when the goats that pulled her father's mill wheel were getting ready to calve, who in the village was unexpectedly tired or happy or sick. She was never wrong either, but somehow nobody ever realized that the slow-looking little girl who said crazy things was always right, so she eventually just stopped telling people things, unless they absolutely needed to know them. like the Slinth, for instance. At noontime, when the sun was overhead and all the adults were gossiping or turning to their day's labor in a desultory fashion, Olbus had already been working hard for hours, carrying feed straw and hides of water for the well to the barn where her little goats lived. There was no river in Yurd, and so Olbus' father, the miller, ground the flowers of yucca with a millstone, which was rotated on the base by a quartet of little goats. And although technically they were her father's goats, they were her responsibility, and she fed and watered and combed them, and she told them everything she noticed. They were the only ones she told. So she felt that they were truly, on some level, her little goats. Olbus loved the goats, who were sturdy and friendly, and even at 8 summers she could see in the goats a microcosm of life in Yurd, plodding along in a circle, expending great effort, but never getting anywhere, never seeing anything new. After she'd emptied 2 skins of water into the trough and patted the goat she called New on the head, and told him that Rogus, the baker's son, had impregnated Lawal, who gleaned flax in the field, she turned to walk back to the well and watched the Slinth fly onto the roof of her own home. Olbus knew that only birds could fly, but it was the only way she knew to describe what had happened. One moment the Slinth was reclining motionless across the plaza, and then the chair was toppling backwards, landing in the sandy loam with a soft sigh, and the Slinth was sprinting toward her, her poncho flapping around her ankles, the brim of her hat, now horizontal, revealing all black eyes that seemed to flash as she drew closer, and a slash of a mouth that may have been set in a grim smile. Little spurts of sand rose behind the Slinth's boots, marking her progress, first running at a full sprint toward Olbus, who at the moment felt she could not move or even imagine moving, then arcing as she reached the edge of the plaza. At her feet hit hard sod, turning from the barn toward the house and attached workshop where Olbus's entire family was bickering and toiling. Olbus, with the obstinacy of the very young and routinely slapped, did not believe the old men when they murmured on the dangers of the Slinth. A Slinth. A Slinth, she reasoned, was basically a big walking flower. This one was even blossoming, and the sheets of wild flowers that would spring up amongst the yellow grasses around the village after the rains were Olbus's absolute favorite things, besides her little goats. She would make little chains and crowns from the flowers, and bedeck the goats, who would then contort themselves into all manner of positions to eat their vestments. She'd never heard of anyone getting hurt by a flower. But seeing the Slinth running at full speed toward her home was scary, and although she could not move, Olbus was able to unhinge her jaw, fill her lungs, and prepare a great shout. At the very last moment, however, when the Slinth was but 2 yards from the cottage, she lunged forward onto a bent leg, curled, and then sprung into the air. The Slinth floated the 8 feet to the thatched roof, arms and legs outstretched, as if she'd been caught in a sudden wind and landed, as she had moved, without a sound. There was an astringent vegetal scent in the air for just a moment, something that Olbus knew deep inside that she'd never experienced before. It smelled like touching a nettle feels, but even so the girl inhaled hungrily. The Slinth nestled into a straw for a moment before slowly, lazily turning, and then she was looking directly at Olbus. Of course she was, the girl realized. The Slinth could see her, standing just inside the barn during her entire run. Now the creature regarded her, and the thin mouth turned up into a smile. She raised one hand and placed a single long finger across her lips before settling her shoulders into the thatch, pulling her poncho over her shoulder, and pulling her hat down over her eyes again. It was that action, that trust, that Olbus would not scream or cry, that made Olbus trust the Slinth in turn. Clearly, if the Slinth meant harm to the people of Yurd, would not have left a prepubescent witness to her machinations. Slight grammatical fault there, I think. Now the Slinth appeared to be doing much the same as she'd done in the plaza, sunbathing. Perhaps, Olbus reasoned, she just wanted to get closer to the sun. Just a big flower. This is about as far as I've read so far. The rest of the story is a mystery to me. I'm thinking the Slinth might be an assassin. We shall see. And so Olbus had not told her family about the Slinth and fretted throughout the day that one of the residents of Yurd would glance upwards and notice the Slinth barely concealed against the slope of the roof. Certainly she would have noticed. She looked up all the time, But to her relief, and despite the peculiar events of the morning, everyone around her was just as slovenly and unobservant as ever. Even when explicitly looking for the Slinth, no one thought to simply walk past the ring of homes and turn to face the plaza. Olbus, to her occasional regret, could not make herself ignore things. She always noticed things all the time. And so that afternoon, of course, she was the first person to see the plume of dust growing larger in the west. Nobody else could even see a Slinth that was napping right above their noses. And maybe she felt a little guilty about keeping that secret, so she told everyone about the dust right away, even though she knew she would probably get slapped. Or maybe she's in hiding from a larger force? Once again, all work in Yurd ceased. The mechanicals of Yurd, as well as the lazy sap wine drinkers, as well as everyone who lived and toiled in the fields outside of Yurd, came in to drink sap wine. Bumpkins, who'd missed the events of the morning, but had now been completely briefed on the ordeal of the Slinth, and indeed felt that their distance from the events gave them a seriousness and clarity of purpose that the villagers who'd actually seen the creature lacked. That's a wonderful line. All conferred on this latest menace. Some thought it was a whole band of Slinths, come on the reconnaissance of the first, clearly a scout, to suck every drop of moisture from Yurd. The competing theory was that it was a company of bounty killers. That was my first guess. Come to capture or destroy the Slinth. And slowly a consensus emerged that, 1. If the travelers were a group of Slinths, the villagers would go at them with torches and scythes to the last man. If the travelers were anything else, the villagers would beseech them to do something, anything, about the Slinth problem. The plume of dust on the horizon got taller and closer until it coalesced behind a traveling party that was distinctly not Slinths. Instead, the dust heralded a group of 15 rough-hewn travelers, riding fast and reckless on saddled boars that screamed and frothed as they ran. So bounty killers it was, the villagers agreed, and prepared to make their beseechment. But as they approached, the bounty killers showed no signs of slowing to allow the residents of Yurd to speak to them, and as they grew closer, the residents themselves began to have second thoughts. As useful as a band of bounty killers could be, they were not in any sense respectable people. And as this particular group grew closer and more visible, they proved to push the limits of imaginable respectability, even for a crew of mercenaries. They brandished totem-festooned firearms and cruel curved knives. They hollered and swore at their mounts and each other. They lacked eyes and limbs, and had fashioned creative replacements. By the time the bounty killers had reached the edge of the desert, close enough for them to notice the entire population of the small hamlet standing in the plaza waiting for them, it was almost dusk, and everyone from Yurd had silently decided to let them pass, to go back to their cottages and warrens and let the night carry this strange day from their minds and township. Everyone, that is, except for N, who had once been a baker, and was the eldest person in the village, which technically, and to his mind, decisively made him the village elder, despite no one else in Yurd thinking of him that way. Oh, poor N. N had not reconsidered the earlier plan, or noticed the growing trepidation amongst his compatriots, and now took action to stop the riders, who were already wheeling to the right to avoid the crowd. "Friends," he called, waving his arms over his head, and stepping into the direct path of 15 vicious galloping boar, and the entire village inhaled sharply and waited for the wet cacophony of him getting trampled by almost 100 pounding hooves. But the bounty killers, for all their aesthetic faults, were excellent riders, and they managed to pull away from the aged baker, straining to calm their mounts as they rounded the plaza. Some sign or call must have been given, because eventually the thunderous circle slowed, and the boars came to shuddering, panting stops. In close quarters, the condottiere, what's the cut aesthetic? Probably more Western. The condottières were no more enticing. They circled the plaza with menace, and it felt like a carousel of brigands and creatures from every corner of Ash. The light of the torches reflected off the body of one figure, covered from head to toe in shiny black chitin, their face a frozen mask of agony, with pointed brows and chin. An ape with a small iron crown strapped to its head grimaced and cavorted on the back of their mount. One who appeared in the crowd as yet another mounted rider was revealed in profile to be both rider and mount. A towering hindran whose hooves pounded the loam as hard as the boar's did, and whose human torso was missing an antler, an eye, a breast, and a hand on her right side. The mere vibrations of the herd had knocked N into the dust, and he struggled to his feet while the largest boar, carrying the largest bounty killer, stomped perilous close to his head. N dusted himself quickly, arranged his robes in a manner that he felt befitted a respected member of the community, and hailed the silent, hulking men. "Good evening, friends. We're so honored that you would come assist our village in this, our hour of greatest need." There was a broad silence. One of the bounty killers, indescribable beneath a recycling suit inscribed with eldritch whorls and runes, muttered something, and the ape barked a quick laugh. And tried again. "We assumed you'd come to save us from the horrible slint infestation that has been visited on us." At this, the bounty killer started, albeit in a slow and extremely fluid manner. It was very visual. He was almost as large as the boar he rode on, double-muscled, with a ragged camis pulled taut over his chest. Camis pulled taut over his chest, and a mantle of furs thrown over a back so cabled it rose to his slit ears. Two horns grew wild and uneven from his forehead, and then he leaned forward on his mount and seemed to completely enshadow the old man despite facing the setting sun. "You saw a slint," he rumbled. Now that his daughter had taken over his stoves and granaries, old N never woke up before afternoon, so he technically had not seen the slint. But he felt that he understood the situation and, more importantly, the danger, more than anyone else, so he continued. "We have seen many slint. Herds of them come in the night, steal our precious dews, and assault our animals. We've lived in fear for many months." Several of the villagers glanced at each other, grimacing. N was laying it on pretty thick. Good line. I like that change. I really like that shift in register. It's like a little bit formal, then it's a little bit goofy. The bounty killer sat back on his boar and made a small, dry sound that might have been a chuckle. He raised one mailed fist, and the rest of the party began digging boot heels into their boars, milling about, preparing to gallop out of Yurd. "My riders are due elsewhere, old man. My riders are due elsewhere, old man," he rasped. This is the only kind of voice I feel qualified to do, is when I get, gruffer and softer. And anyway, N, sensing that his time as village spokesperson was about to come to an end, blurted one more plea. "We can pay, of course." The villagers looked at each other, startled. Several began to shake their heads. The leader lowered his fist. "How much could you pay?" he rumbled. The people of Yurd are prepared to pay 20 coppers, and said, pleased to be saying something that someone wanted to hear. Everyone not seated on a boar looked at each other, the cold feeling of dread curdling in their stomachs. There was no way N had 20 coppers. You might not be able to find 20 coppers in Yurd if you dug up every hearth in the village. 20 coppers? The bounty killer thought for a moment, and then, lifting one leg, which seemed surprisingly small considering the rest of him, slid from his boar. "The day grows late," he growled. "We'll stay here overnight and avail ourselves of your hospitality. In the morning we'll ride out to solve your slint problem." He now took a step toward N, who smiled blankly. "I will also take the coppers now." The smile melted from N's lips, and he opened his mouth, and everyone from Yurd began to slowly walk backward, because nothing N was going to say was going to make the situation better. Yurd itself was already lost. The riders would probably burn to the ground, but anyone who could make it to the fields could lie between the rows and possibly escape death. Afterward, Olbus would remember seeing blood rosette from the bounty killer's chest before she heard the retorts of the gun, even though she was a smart girl and knew that it had to have gone the other way. The gun shot first and the wound after. As soon as the bounty killers galloped into Yurd, Olbus ran to the thatched roof barn where the goats lived, petting them and speaking softly to them, so that the rank musk of the boar would not frighten him too greatly. As old N spoke to the leader, she stepped to the gate of the barn and watched her fingers nervously rubbing the beard of the bravest goat who'd followed her. It is a testament to the bounty killers and their ability to read situations that when their leader stumbled backward, staring at the two holes that had suddenly appeared just below his ribcage, not one of them cut down N. Instead, they sprung into readiness. As if they had not already been holding a weapon, they drew them. About half of the remaining raiders drew firearms, while the remainder wielded an assortment of well-worn blades and cudgels, and almost watched as they pointed and screamed across the plaza at her own home. The nomad in the recycling suit was struggling to load a rifle with ribbed, rubber-covered fingers, when a bullet tore through their chest, sending twin arcs of water and blood jetting out behind them. Standing against the thatch of the roof, indeed lying on her right side on the incline, was the Slinth, outlined in gold from the dusk. Her arms were outstretched, and she held 2 revolvers wrapped in her tendril fingers, with 2 wrapping the butts and 2 working the hammers and triggers like clockwork, spitting out an unrelenting burst of fire. By the time the guns fell silent, the villagers had fled from the plaza, and 3 of the marauders who had pulled firearms were bleeding in the dirt, their bores already rooting through their entrails. Those still mounted had regrouped and were rushing the miller's hut, and Olbus watched, frozen in place, as the Slinth spun away from the roof, almost floating to the ground, her fronds dancing over the pieces as she reloaded in motion. Then she slid around the far side of the hut, where there were 2 more muffled shots, and the closest raiders fell from their bores, freezing in the space where they'd been hit and tumbling backward as their mounts ran from beneath them. It was darker now. Evening had fallen faster than Olbus had realized, and the Slinth was only visible as a shadow now, flitting between the 2 loose bores with ease and scribing an arc around the remaining marauders. The carapace rider turned first, and the Slinth moved just inches in front of the arc of a black blade that arced and pointed like fire, at the same time firing 1 piece directly into their torso. The armored rider fell to the ground, immediately preceding the ape, who had been waving a revolver in the air wildly but with no sense of direction or purpose before catching a bullet in the throat. There were now too many things in the area immediately in front of Miller's cottage. Raiders both writhing and dead, boars circling back, confused from the fields immediately beyond the cottage, and milling through them the 4 remaining riders. They found themselves unable to maneuver or even turn in the great press of bodies, while the Slinth moved around the perimeter toward the barn, firing into the scrum. Something hit a boar, either one of the Slinth's bullets or some blade held by a rider, as they slept, and it began to bellow, passing anger and rage among the herd, which began to thrash even more wildly. The Hindran, trapped in the press, shouted and struck at her panicked captors with the flat edge of her kriss, but was unable to move them before some injury, Olbus could not see what, caused her to falter and fall. The Slinth had almost entirely circumscribed the mess in front of the cottage, moving back out into the now deserted plaza toward the first fallen bodies, where the chitinized rider rose out of the dark. Moving surprisingly quickly for a creature of its size, it grasped the gunslinger around her waist and brought her to the ground, raising 1 segmented arm in the air. The Slinth twisted under the rider. The barrel of the revolver spat a fire that illuminated the tableau and burned it into Olbus's mind, the huge fist of the rider descending in flashes as the synth fired once, twice, into the rictus of the rider's gruesome faceplate. Only on the third shot did something shatter with a large crick. The rider collapsed forward. Even before they settled, the Slinth had slid away, and Olbus lost her in the gloom. Only 2 riders were still mounted now. The other 2 had been incapacitated by the terrified boar and slid injured to the ground. They were trying to fight their way out of the scrum, looking for something to kill, when 2 more shots rang out, and they both fell noiselessly. Then the Slinth emerged, her silhouette detached from the shadows of barns and cottages and coalescing into the dusk light. She holstered her guns and moved into the plaza. The bandit leader was still alive, improbably, and was pulling himself along the dust, leaving twin trails of bloody clay. He said something to the Slinth when her shadow fell upon him, a 1-syllable exclamation of "Stop!" or "Wait!" And then the Slinth struck something in the back of his neck like a key going to a lock, and he went. She stooped over his body for a few seconds, drawing something from his belt pouch, then drew herself to her full height and, without glancing back, simply walked into the desert. Olbus only told his story out loud once. After an hour, the groans of the dying had quieted, and the villagers who'd scattered into the fields hesitantly crept back into their homes. She was the only person who had remained in the village. Her parents hadn't even realized she wasn't with them, and so she was the only person to see what the Slinth had done. There was a carnival atmosphere, with lit torches and the rush of unexpected good fortune as the villagers searched and moved the bodies, butchered the 1 boar that had died and penned the rest. And after the immediate work was done, everyone gathered around to listen to Olbus. who no one ever listened to, of course. She only told the story out loud once, because as soon as she related the bare facts, it wasn't her story anymore. Anne stood up and told the exact same story that Olbus just told, only now there were 30 riders and 5 sliths, even though the bodies cooling in the sand still numbered only 15. Next, the cobbler stood and told the story of the 40 brave outriders who'd saved Yurd from a teeming field of slith, and Olbus, who lived in Yurd all of her 8 years, returned to her goats. The villagers waited for someone to claim the bodies or come looking for them, but no one ever did. The money and goods they carried were distributed amongst the townsfolk after almost no discussion at all, and after the boars proved too unruly to keep for long, they were dispatched, one by one, for a series of feasts that were talked about in Yurd for generations. The massacre had done well for Yurd. The next day, Olbus snuck behind her home and, using the jigs between the timbers for handholds, climbed up onto the roof. She couldn't say why, but she knew she had to get up there. Had to see where the slith had waited, basking in the sun. Tucked into the thatch was the flower that had blossomed in the slith's shoulder the morning previous. It was white and violet, and it sprouted from a small pod, ringed with tendrils which gripped the reeds. The air was perfumed with the sharp, prickly scent that Olbus had caught in the wind when the synth flew. Olbus only told the story of the slith to other people once, but she told it to herself again and again. And to her goats, of course. It was on her lips and on her mind 5 years later when she took the flower, which had grown in the thatch, but not by much, and tucked it into her thick braid, where it dug into her hair before settling, and shouldering a long gun and wishing a fond farewell to her goats, walked into the jungles of the east. Wow. Remarkably emotional there in the end. Maybe this is not CUD fan fiction, it's just CUD-like. I'm going to add a note to that effect at the beginning of this video, as I now realize it at the end. I saw it linked from Tychomancer, the one of the designers and the narrative dude on Caves of CUD, which is what made me think that in the first place. And I'll probably add that to my note at the beginning. Anyway, this has been by way of a pilot recording. I'll certainly re-record it, should Mark decide that he wants that to be a thing that exists in the world, and if not, well, I convinced myself to finish reading it by recording it, and that is all that I need. Thanks.